Unaware she inherited her late father's 500-nascent empire, she stood in her dining room as a second-grade teacher. Recently honored as Teacher of the Year, listening to her husband, a rising attorney about to make partner, mock her for being beneath his status, and demand a divorce because she wasn't worthy of his success. She absorbed every cruel word with quiet composure, her hand steady even as he declared she was nothing compared to what he was becoming. But what he didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, a manila envelope from her late father's estate attorney had arrived in the mail, sitting unopened on her desk at school because she'd been too consumed with planning their anniversary dinner to read it. The envelope contained documents revealing that her father, the quiet high school janitor she remembered sweeping hallways and packing her lunches in brown paper bags, had secretly built a commercial real estate empire worth $500 million before his sudden death. And she was the sole heir. Her husband, standing in their kitchen with his briefcase and his contempt, had no idea that the woman he was divorcing for being beneath his status was about to become wealthier than he could earn in 10 lifetimes. But would she tell him the truth before signing the papers? Or would she let him beg to come back after discovering what he'd thrown away? And when he finally learned that the Teacher of the Year he mocked was now the owner of the very building where his law firm leased office space, what would she do with the power to decide his professional future? The Tuesday night in October when everything shattered began like any celebration should, with her hands covered in lemon zest and hope. She had spent 3 hours preparing his favorite meal, the cold salmon with dill sauce her mother used to make, the one that required precision timing and a specific Portuguese white wine she'd driven across town to find. The dining room table glowed with new candles she'd bought that morning, their light catching the crystal glasses her grandmother had left her, the same glasses she'd wrapped in newspaper and carried in a cardboard box when she moved into this house 5 years ago. As a bride who believed love could fill any space, the Teacher of the Year plaque sat propped against the centerpiece, still in its velvet presentation box because she wanted him to see it first. Wanted to watch his face when he realized his wife, the one he sometimes introduced as just a teacher, had been recognized by the entire district for excellence. She checked her phone again at 7:30, then 8, then 8:45. Watching the salmon grow cold and the candles burn down to stubs. And somewhere in the waiting, she remembered the manila envelope that had arrived 3 weeks earlier, the one from Whitmore and Associates estate attorneys with the return address in Hartford, Connecticut. She left it unopened on her desk at school, buried under spelling tests and permission slips because the sender's name had triggered a memory of her father's funeral 6 months ago. The small service where only 12 people came to mourn a high school janitor who died of a heart attack while cleaning the gymnasium after a basketball game. She hadn't wanted to think about estate paperwork or final bills during anniversary week. Hadn't wanted grief to color what should have been celebration, so she pushed the envelope to the back of her mind the same way she pushed down the growing suspicion that her husband's late nights weren't all about case preparation. When he finally walked through the door at 10:47, his tie already loosened and his expression carved from stone, she stood from the table with a smile that felt like lifting weights. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the cold food or the burned-down candles or the plaque that represented a year of staying late to tutor struggling readers and creating a classroom library with her own money. Instead, he set his briefcase down with a decisive click of a man about to deliver a verdict and launched into a monologue that sounded rehearsed. Each word selected for maximum damage. He told her he was about to make partner, that his trajectory was ascending, while hers had plateaued in a second-grade classroom, that he'd made a mistake marrying someone whose ambitions ended with construction paper and parent-teacher conferences. His voice carried the measured cruelty of closing arguments as he explained that from now on he would decide when they spoke and how they spent time together. Because his career demanded a wife who understood hierarchy, and she clearly didn't understand that teaching phonics to 7-year-olds didn't put her on his level. She absorbed each word with a stillness that surprised her, feeling something inside her chest not break, but crystallize into clarity. And as he talked about status and levels and the difference between people who build empires and people who babysit other people's children, she thought about her father again. The quiet man who'd packed her lunches in brown paper bags with handwritten notes tucked inside. Who taught her to read before kindergarten using newspaper comics and patience, who Died in a gymnasium wearing a janitor's uniform with his name embroidered in red thread above the pocket. She didn't tell her husband about the envelope that night. She didn't tell him that her father, the man he'd met exactly once at their wedding and dismissed with a handshake that lasted less than 3 seconds, might have left her something worth examining. Instead, she listened until his monologue ended, watched him walk to the bedroom without touching her, and stood alone in the dining room, surrounded by the ruins of her celebration. The candles had burned out completely. The salmon looked gray in the darkness. The plaque caught a sliver of moonlight through the window, its gold lettering announcing her as Teacher of the Year in a script that suddenly seemed defiant rather than decorative. She cleared the table in silence, wrapping the uneaten food in aluminum foil with mechanical precision. And when she finally climbed into bed at 1 o'clock in the morning, careful not to disturb the man already asleep on his side of the mattress, she made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. She would give him exactly what he asked for. Silence so complete he'd feel its weight in every room of this house. And tomorrow during her lunch break, she would drive to school and open that manila envelope. The one she'd been avoiding because grief felt too heavy to carry alongside hope. Something in her father's careful life whispered to her across 6 months of death, suggesting that the janitor who'd raised her alone after her mother left might have understood more about empires than anyone suspected. The next morning arrived with cruel sunshine that made the dining room look even worse in daylight. She woke at 5:30, her internal alarm clock trained by years of early teaching schedules, and moved through the house like she was remembering choreography from a play she'd stopped performing. She made coffee for one, measuring grounds with the precision she brought to lesson planning. And when he emerged from the bedroom at 6:15, expecting his cup already prepared with 2 sugars and cream, she met his confusion with polite indifference that felt like speaking a new language. He asked where his coffee was, his voice carrying the irritation of someone whose routine had been disrupted, and she gestured toward the pot with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, suggesting he help himself since he'd established new household rules the night before. The flicker of surprise on his face fed something hungry inside her. She ate her breakfast, Greek yogurt with honey and almonds, while reading the news on her phone, ignoring his presence at the table the way he'd ignored her salmon and candles. When he attempted conversation about his day, she responded with single words, okay, sure, fine. Each monosyllable landed like a period at the end of a sentence he couldn't finish. She left for school at 7:15 without saying goodbye. Her Teacher of the Year plaque tucked in her bag alongside the envelope she'd finally decided to confront. And as she drove through morning traffic toward the elementary school where she'd taught for 8 years, she felt something she hadn't experienced in her entire marriage. The lightness of not caring what he thought. Her classroom smelled like crayons and possibility when she arrived. The familiar scent grounding her as she set her bag on the desk and pulled out the manila envelope that had been haunting her periphery for 3 weeks. The return address stared back at her. Whitmore and Associates, Estate Attorneys, Hartford, Connecticut. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. That irrational fear that official mail always brings mixed with curiosity about why her father's estate would require attorneys from Hartford when he lived his entire life in a small apartment above a hardware store in their hometown. The first document she unfolded was a cover letter on expensive letterhead, the kind with embossed text and weight that suggested importance. And the opening line made her sit down hard in her desk chair. Dear Miss Patricia Henshaw, we are writing to inform you that as the sole beneficiary of your late father, Mr. Robert James Henshaw, you have inherited his complete estate, currently valued at approximately $500 million. She read the sentence 3 times, certain she'd misunderstood or that someone had made a catastrophic typo. But the numbers remained unchanged. And as she forced herself to continue reading, the impossible story of her father's secret life unfolded in legal language that felt like discovering a novel written in invisible ink. Her father, the janitor who'd raised her on modest means, who'd driven a 15-year-old Toyota and shopped at discount grocery stores, had apparently spent 40 years quietly buying commercial real estate properties across New England. Starting with a single foreclosed warehouse he'd purchased for $30,000 in 1984 and building an empire so discreet that even his own daughter had no idea she'd been raised by a man worth $500 million. The letter explained that Robert Henshaw had operated through a series of holding companies and trusts designed to maintain absolute privacy, that his janitorial work had been a choice rather than necessity, a way to stay grounded and connected to regular people, while his investments compounded in the background. The attorney's letter listed properties she'd never heard of. Office buildings in Hartford, Boston, and Providence. Warehouse complexes in Connecticut and Massachusetts, retail centers that generated millions in annual rent from tenants who had no idea their landlord spent his days mopping floors and emptying trash cans. There were spreadsheets attached, pages of financial statements showing income and assets that made her teaching salary look like pocket change, and at the bottom of the stack, a handwritten letter from her father, online notebook paper, the kind he used to write her lunch notes on, his familiar script bringing tears to her eyes before she'd read a single word. "My dear Patricia," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone and you're probably confused as hell. I'm sorry I never told you the truth about the money. I watched my own father destroy himself chasing wealth. Watched him ignore family for profit. And I swore I'd never let money define me or corrupt the one thing that mattered. You. I worked as a janitor because it kept me humble. Because it let me be present at your school when you were growing up. Because honest work feeds the soul in ways that collecting rent checks never could. But I also understood that money is freedom. And I wanted you to have freedom when you were old enough to use it wisely. The attorneys will help you navigate everything. But here's what matters. You're now the owner of properties that include the Whitmore Tower in Boston, the Maritime Building in Providence, and the Hartford Commerce Center. You're wealthy beyond what most people dream of. But more importantly, you're free to choose the life you want rather than the life circumstances force on you. Use this freedom to be happy, to leave any situation that diminishes you, to never let anyone make you feel small. Your mother left because she couldn't understand why I chose janitorial work when I had money. Don't let anyone else's inability to see your worth determine your path. I love you. Build something beautiful with this freedom, Dad." She sat in her classroom for 20 minutes after reading his letter, tears streaming down her face while second graders shouted on the playground outside her window, their joy a counterpoint to the earthquake, reshaping her understanding of everything. Her father had been a secret millionaire. No, a secret multimillionaire who'd chosen to mop floors and pack her humble lunches and live in a modest apartment because he valued presence over prestige. And now she owned buildings, including ones she'd walked past 100 times without knowing they belonged to her bloodline. The irony hit her like a physical force. Her husband had spent last night explaining that she was beneath his status, that teaching made her small, that his partnership would elevate him above her, but she was now wealthy enough to buy his entire law firm 10 times over. The Hartford Commerce Center, she pulled out her phone and searched the address, was a gleaming office tower in downtown Hartford, home to law firms, financial consultancies, and corporate headquarters. She scrolled through the building's website, looking at the tenant directory, and her breath caught when she saw the listing for his firm, Blackwell Morrison and Chase LLP, floors 15 to 17. Her husband's law firm, the place where he was about to make partner. The symbol of his superiority over her, was leasing space in a building she now owned. She was his landlord. The woman he declared beneath his level was literally above him in the most concrete way possible. The bell rang for first period and she wiped her tears, tucked the documents back into the envelope with shaking hands, and stood to welcome her students with a smile that felt like it belonged to someone else. 23 second graders filed into her classroom with their backpacks and their questions and their complete faith that she knew everything about everything, and she taught them about vowel sounds and addition with her usual patience while her mind spun with possibilities. During her lunch break, she called Whitmore and Associates and spoke with the attorney who'd sent the package, a woman named Victoria Chen, who explained the inheritance in detail and offered to connect her with financial advisors who specialized in managing large estates. Patricia asked only one question that mattered. Can I access these funds immediately? Victoria's answer was yes. The estate had cleared probate. Everything was in order. She just needed to sign transfer documents and the money would be hers to control. Patricia made an appointment for Saturday morning in Hartford, thanked Victoria with a calmness she didn't feel, and hung up the phone with trembling hands. Then she sat alone in her classroom eating a turkey sandwich she couldn't taste, and made the second decision that would define everything that followed. She wouldn't tell her husband about the inheritance. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He'd asked for silence and distance. Claimed she was beneath him, demanded control of their communication, and she would give him exactly what he requested, while quietly building an escape route paved with her father's legacy. The revenge forming in her mind wasn't loud or dramatic. It was strategic, patient, and devastating in its simplicity. She would let him believe she was the small teacher he could dismiss, would let him proceed with whatever plans he'd made about their marriage, would document every cruel word and dismissive gesture while sitting on a fortune that made his partnership bonus look like a tip at a restaurant. And when the time came to reveal the truth, she would do it in a way that would haunt him forever. That evening, she came home to find him on the couch with takeout Chinese food. His tie discarded and his expression somewhere between confusion and irritation. He asked where she'd been, why she hadn't texted, whether she'd forgotten they usually watch their show on Wednesday nights. She met his questions with the same polite indifference from breakfast, explaining she'd had pottery class, a lie, but one that established independence, and wasn't hungry for dinner. His confusion deepened when she went straight to the bedroom, changed into comfortable clothes, and settled on the bed with a book she didn't read. Her mind too busy calculating next steps. He appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, his posture suggesting he wanted to talk, but didn't know how to start, and she felt a flicker of satisfaction at his discomfort. He was beginning to notice that the household machinery he'd taken for granted, the prepared meals, the maintained schedule, the emotional labor of keeping their life running smoothly, had suddenly stopped operating. She wasn't serving him anymore, wasn't anticipating his needs, wasn't performing the role of supportive wife he'd assigned her. The silence he demanded was costing him more than he'd calculated, and they were only 2 days into her experiment. She wondered how long it would take before he started to unravel, before the weight of running his own life without her infrastructure became unbearable. Part of her, the part that had absorbed his cruelty in the dining room, hoped it would hurt. But a deeper part, the part connected to her father's wisdom about freedom and worth, simply wanted to be free of him entirely. To walk away from this marriage with her dignity intact and her future secure. The $500 million wasn't revenge money. It was freedom. Money. And freedom, she was learning, tasted better than any vengeance. The following days unfolded with careful choreography as she rebuilt her life while living in the same house as a man who was slowly realizing he'd been essential to her existence, but she'd been vital to his. She started waking at 5 o'clock, leaving for the gym before he got up, returning to shower and dress for work, while he stumbled around the kitchen looking for clean coffee mugs that were no longer magically appearing in the cabinet. His dry cleaning went uncollected because she'd always been the one to remember pickup days. His favorite shirt stayed wrinkled because she'd stopped doing his laundry along with her own. The refrigerator emptied because she stopped grocery shopping for 2, buying only what she needed for her own meals and watching his confusion grow when he opened the door to find yogurt, salad ingredients, and wine meant for one person. She met his increasingly desperate questions with calm explanations. She'd taken him at his word about establishing new boundaries, about him deciding when they interacted, about her not being on his level. If she was beneath him, surely he didn't need her managing the mundane details of his elevated life. The logic was airtight, and watching him struggle to find a counterargument fed the cold satisfaction growing in her chest. Meanwhile, on Saturday morning, she drove to Hartford and signed papers that made her one of the wealthiest women in New England. Walked out of Whitmore and Associates with access to bank accounts she still couldn't quite believe were real, and stopped at a coffee shop to sit with her new reality. She ordered an expensive latte without checking the price, pulled out her phone, and did something she hadn't done in 5 years of marriage. She looked at apartment listings in the city, beautiful spaces with hardwood floors and natural light, places where she could build a life that belonged entirely to her. By the second week of her silence campaign, he was calling her during work hours, something he'd never done before, leaving voicemails that progressed from confused to irritated to something approaching panic. She didn't call back. She redirected her energy toward the life she was constructing in secret. She met with a divorce attorney her friend had recommended, a sharp woman named Margaret Torres, who listened to her story with the focused intensity of someone who'd seen this pattern before and knew exactly how to dismantle it. Margaret explained Massachusetts divorce law with clinical precision. Their assets would be divided equitably. His partnership and income potential were marital property. And more importantly, any inheritance received during the marriage was typically considered separate property, meaning the $500 million was hers alone. Patricia felt a weight lift from her shoulders she hadn't known she was carrying. She wouldn't need his money or his approval to leave. She was leaving from a position of absolute financial power. And he had no idea. Margaret helped her document everything. The cruel speech on their anniversary, his pattern of dismissiveness. Text messages where he demeaned her career, emails where he'd excluded her from social events with his colleagues. Because she was just a teacher who wouldn't fit in with successful people. They built a case methodically, brick by brick, creating a foundation for divorce proceedings that would be swift and decisive. And through it all, Patricia maintained her silence at home, watching him deteriorate in real time as the infrastructure of his comfortable life collapsed around him. On day 12, she came home from her actual pottery class. She'd enrolled after using it as a cover story, discovering she loved the meditative process of shaping clay to find him sitting at the dining room table with his head in his hands, his laptop open to what looked like work documents, but his eyes unfocused and exhausted. He looked up when she entered. And she saw the cracks in his polished exterior. Dark circles under his eyes. Stubble he hadn't shaved. A stain on his shirt that suggested he'd been wearing it for more than one day. He asked if they could talk, his voice stripped of the courtroom confidence he'd wielded 2 weeks earlier. And she sat down her bag with deliberate slowness, folded her arms, and told him she was listening. He launched into an apology that sounded rehearsed but desperate. Explaining that he'd been under stress about the partnership, that he'd said things he didn't mean, that he missed her and wanted to fix their marriage. She listened without expression, noting the careful absence of any real accountability. He blamed stress, not character, circumstances, not choices. When he finished, she asked a single question that cut through his performance. Are you apologizing because you realize you were wrong or because you realize I've stopped making your life easy? The silence that followed gave her the answer. His face cycled through emotions, surprise, anger, calculation before settling on something like shame. She told him she needed time to think, that 2 weeks of silence couldn't undo years of feeling diminished, and walked to the bedroom. While he sat frozen at the table. That night, she slept deeply for the first time since their anniversary, dreaming of her father sweeping gymnasium floors while owning the building he cleaned, understanding finally that his lesson had been about never letting external validation determine internal worth. The break came on day 15 during her lunch period at school when he appeared in the lobby carrying an enormous bouquet of roses that looked absurd against his expensive suit and desperate eyes. Teachers stopped in the hallway to watch, their curiosity palpable, and Patricia felt a surge of irritation at him for bringing their private disaster into her professional space. She walked toward him slowly, her Teacher of the Year composure firmly in place, and asked what he was doing there. His apology was public this time, loud enough for witnesses, full of promises about counseling and change, and recognizing her value. He suggested dinner at the restaurant where they had had their first date. His voice carrying the charm he probably used in court to sway juries. And for a moment she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then she remembered the cold salmon and his monologue about levels and hierarchy. Remembered her father's letter about never letting anyone make her feel small. And she delivered the line she'd been rehearsing in her head for 2 weeks. You told me you would decide when we spoke and spent time together. I'm just following the rules you established. I don't recall you deciding we should have dinner tonight. The logic landed like a slap. His face went through another series of emotions before settling on anger. The mask finally dropping to reveal what had always been underneath. His polished entitlement. He called her manipulative, accused her of playing games, suggested she was being emotionally abusive by withholding communication. And she laughed, the sound sharp and clean and utterly without humor. She told him she had her own apartment now, that she'd be moving her things out this weekend, and watched his carefully constructed apology crumble into ash. He dropped the roses. Actually dropped them on the lobby floor like a child having a tantrum. And she walked away down the hallway while her colleagues watched in stunned silence. Behind her, she heard him calling her name, but she didn't turn around. The woman who was beneath his level had just walked out of his control, and the roses wilted on the linoleum like a memorial to his arrogance. That weekend, Margaret Torres filed divorce papers that landed on his desk at Blackwell, Morrison, and Chase on Monday morning at 9:15. Delivered by a process server who found him in a conference room with 3 partners and a client. Patricia received the confirmation text delivered while teaching her second graders about the water cycle. And she felt a surge of satisfaction so pure it almost frightened her. She'd stopped being the supporting character in his story and become the author of her own. And the plot she was writing had a very specific ending. That evening, she changed her phone number, blocked him on all social media platforms, and began the systematic process of erasing him from her life with the same methodical precision she brought to lesson planning. His family started reaching out. His mother, his sister, colleagues who thought they were helping, but she ignored every attempt at contact. Her boundaries now absolute. Then his sister sent a text to her old number that somehow reached her through a mutual friend. Apparently, he'd been telling his family for months that their marriage was over, that he planned to leave Patricia after making partner because she was holding him back professionally. The revelation should have hurt, but instead it clarified everything. He'd been planning his exit while she cooked his dinners and managed his life, had been positioning himself to leave her after securing his partnership, probably had already selected a replacement wife who better fit his image of success. Her only regret was that she'd beaten him to it. And that her version of leaving came with resources he couldn't imagine. The next phase of her carefully constructed revenge began 3 weeks after the divorce filing, when she had her attorney send a letter to Blackwell, Morrison, and Chase regarding their lease at Hartford Commerce Center. The letter was professional, almost bland, introducing Patricia Henshaw as the new owner of the building and requesting a meeting to discuss lease renewal terms that were coming up in 6 months. She imagined his face when he saw her name on the letterhead, imagined him connecting the dots between his soon-to-be ex-wife and the landlord who controlled his firm's office space. And the image filled her with a joy so dark it should have concerned her, but didn't. She wasn't planning to evict them. That would be too obvious, too petty, too easy to spin as vindictive. But she wanted him to know that she had power over his professional environment. That the woman he deemed beneath his status was literally above him in the building hierarchy. The irony was too perfect to resist. Margaret loved the move, calling it elegant psychological warfare, and helped her craft additional letters to other properties where his firm's partners had investments or connections. Nothing threatening, nothing actionable. Just gentle reminders that Patricia Henshaw owned a significant portion of Hartford's commercial real estate and would be taking a more active role in management going forward. She was establishing herself in his professional world as someone who couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Someone whose presence would be a constant reminder of what he'd thrown away. For weeks after the divorce filing, he showed up at her new apartment. She still didn't know how he'd found the address. carrying 2 coffee cups from their old cafe and wearing an expression of practiced vulnerability that probably worked on juries but left her completely unmoved. She opened the door just wide enough to block entry, her body language making clear he wasn't welcome inside, and listened to his rehearsed speech about therapy breakthroughs and self-awareness and understanding now what he'd failed to see before. He used words like growth and healing in partnership with the conviction of someone who'd spent hours with a counselor, learning the vocabulary of redemption. But his eyes told a different story. They were calculating, scanning her apartment for clues about her new life, trying to gather information he could use. She let him finish his performance, then asked the single question that mattered. Is this about love or about damage control? Before your partnership review? The silence that followed was answer enough. His face went blank, then defensive. Then he tried to pivot to anger, demanding to know who she thought she was to question his motives, reminding her that he was about to make partner at one of Hartford's most prestigious firms. And that's when she decided to detonate the bomb she'd been carefully constructing. She told him the truth, that she was the owner of the Hartford Commerce Center, that his firm paid rent to her holding company, that she'd inherited more money than he would earn in multiple lifetimes, and that the janitor father he'd met once and dismissed had built an empire while mopping floors. The information hit him like a physical force. She watched him process it in stages, disbelief, then skepticism, then dawning horror as he realized she wasn't lying. That the woman he'd called small and beneath him was now one of the wealthiest people in Connecticut. His reaction was everything she'd hoped for and somehow still disappointing. He cycled through emotions rapidly. Shock giving way to anger, giving way to calculation, giving way to something that looked like he was running numbers in his head, probably trying to figure out what his share of $500 million would be in the divorce. She watched him arrive at that conclusion, saw the moment his apology transformed into strategy, and she delivered the final blow with a smile that felt like victory. It's inheritance, which means it's separate property. You get nothing from my father's estate. The only thing you're entitled to is half of what we built together during our marriage, which is basically this house and your partnership potential. The words landed like grenades. He tried to argue, started citing case law about asset division, threatened to drag out the divorce and make it expensive. And she simply laughed. The same sharp, clean sound from the school lobby. She reminded him that she had documentation of everything, that she had recordings of his phone calls and screenshots of his texts, that she had witnesses to his public meltdown at her school, and that she had resources to pay attorneys forever if necessary. Then she told him the part that would haunt him the longest. You were right that we weren't on the same level. You just misjudged the direction. I teach children to read and think and be kind. You teach corporations to exploit loopholes and avoid taxes. My level is about building human beings. Your level is about billing hours. We were never in competition because we weren't playing the same game. His face went pale, then red, then gray, and she closed the door, while he was still standing in her hallway holding his coffee cups like props in a play that had ended without him noticing. She poured both coffees down her sink, rinsed the cups, and placed them in her recycling bin with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything now. The air in her apartment felt cleaner somehow, as if closing the door on him had released toxic fumes she'd been breathing for years. The divorce finalized 4 months later in a conference room that smelled like furniture polish and barely contained hostility. They sat across from each other at a mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars, their attorneys flanking them like seconds in a duel, and signed papers that dissolved 5 years of marriage in approximately 30 minutes. She reclaimed her maiden name, Patricia Henshaw, the name her father had carried while building his secret empire, and received her settlement, which was tiny compared to her inheritance, but felt symbolically important anyway. She kept the house they'd shared because she decided she wanted to sell it and donate the proceeds to her school's literacy program, a final act of transformation that would turn their shared history into something useful for children who needed books. He kept his partnership, which he'd finally achieved 3 weeks earlier in a ceremony she heard about. Through mutual friends, but didn't attend. She watched him across that conference room table as he signed the final documents. And what struck her most was how small he looked, not physically, but existentially. As if the dissolution of their marriage had revealed that his impressive exterior had been hollow all along. Her attorney, Margaret, squeezed her hand under the table when the last signature was complete. A gesture of solidarity. That meant more than the settlement check. They left through different exits. Her idea because she didn't want to share even a parking lot with him anymore. The sunlight outside felt warmer than normal. Or maybe she was just feeling warmth for the first time in years. The heat of freedom finally reaching skin that had been cold for too long. 6 months after the divorce, Patricia sat in her apartment on a Sunday morning, surrounded by pottery. She'd made herself bowls and vases and cups that were imperfect but beautiful. Proof that she could create things with her own hands and drink coffee that tasted better than any she'd ever had. Her second graders had just finished their spring showcase where they'd read poems they'd written about things that mattered to them. And 3 kids had written about Mrs. Henshaw, their teacher, who believed they could do anything. She'd cried at her desk after school that day, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of her life's direction. The revenge she'd taken on her ex-husband wasn't really revenge at all. It was reclamation. She'd reclaimed her name, her identity, her worth, her future, and most importantly, her understanding that external validation couldn't define internal reality. Her father had known that truth, had lived it every day while pushing a mop across floors he owned. And now she carried his lesson forward in her own way. She taught children to read because reading was freedom. Because literacy was power, because the ability to understand the world through text was the foundation of everything else. And she owned buildings because her father had given her that gift. But she never let the buildings own her. She donated to schools, funded literacy programs, sat on boards for educational nonprofits, and lived in a 2-bedroom apartment that cost a fraction of what she could afford because she didn't need marble and granite to prove her worth. Her ex-husband had wanted partnership and prestige and the external markers of success. She had wanted freedom and purpose and the internal knowledge that her life mattered. The punishment she'd given him wasn't financial or professional. It was the knowledge that he'd had something real and chosen. Something hollow, that he'd valued the wrong things and lost the right person. And that he would spend the rest of his life knowing that the woman he'd called small had been standing on a mountain while he measured himself with a ruler. That knowledge would follow him through every partnership meeting, every social event, every moment he looked at successful women and wondered if they too had hidden depths he was too shallow to recognize. And Patricia, for her part, would wake up every morning in her imperfect apartment, drink her perfect coffee, and go teach children that worth was internal and freedom was the greatest inheritance of all. Proof that the most elegant revenge was simply living